The Mississippi Delta in 1855 was a land of contradictions, where wealth and brutality coexisted so seamlessly that many who lived there stopped noticing the cruelty beneath the surface. Vast cotton fields stretched toward the horizon, their neat rows presenting an image of order and prosperity. The plantation houses stood elevated and proud, symbols of refinement borrowed from Europe, masking the violence that sustained them. To outsiders, the Whitaker plantation appeared successful, even admirable. To those who lived within its boundaries, it was a carefully managed illusion, held together by fear, silence, and power. Thomas Whitaker owned the land, the house, and more than 100 enslaved men, women, and children. Ownership was not merely economic, it was psychological. His authority shaped every interaction, every movement, every breath taken on the plantation. Yet despite his control, Thomas was a restless man. The pressures of debt, competition with neighboring planters, and the unspoken expectation to embody Southern masculine dominance weighed heavily on him. He spent long days away from the house, riding between properties or attending meetings where men reassured one another that their way of life was natural, moral, and eternal. His wife, Eleanor Whitaker, lived a quieter, more confined existence. She had married Thomas as a teenager, guided into the match by family ambition rather than affection. At first, she believed marriage would bring purpose and belonging. Instead, it delivered isolation. The plantation was large, but her world was small. Her duties revolved around supervising the household, entertaining guests when required, and maintaining an image of grace and obedience. Love was never discussed. Emotional fulfillment was not considered necessary for a woman of her station. Years passed without children, and this absence slowly reshaped Eleanor's position within the household and the wider community. In the antebellum South, motherhood defined a woman's worth. Childlessness invited pity at best and suspicion at worst. Eleanor felt eyes linger on her at church, heard whispers behind polite smiles. She internalized the judgment, blaming her body, her temperament, herself. Thomas never spoke openly about it, but his disappointment manifested in distance. He withdrew emotionally, leaving Eleanor alone in a marriage that felt increasingly performative. Inside the Whitaker house, enslaved people moved with trained precision. They were present everywhere and nowhere at once, expected to anticipate needs while remaining unseen. Among them was Samuel, a man who had been born on the plantation and raised into servitude without ever knowing freedom. By his late 20s, he had learned the art of restraint, how to speak only when spoken to, how to keep his eyes lowered, how to sense danger before it announced itself. He worked primarily indoors, trusted with responsibilities that required proximity to the Whitakers, a trust rooted not in respect but in ownership. Samuel understood the risks of his position. Enslaved men who worked inside the house walked a narrow line. Too much visibility invited suspicion, too little could be interpreted as defiance. Any interaction with white women carried particular danger. Southern society was obsessed with the idea of white female purity, an obsession used to justify violence against black men. Even false accusations could lead to brutal punishment or death. Samuel carried this knowledge with him constantly, shaping every gesture and expression. Eleanor noticed Samuel gradually, almost against her will. At first, he was simply another servant, part of the background noise of plantation life. Over time, his presence became distinct. He moved differently from others, quieter, more deliberate. He spoke with careful politeness, his voice steady even under scrutiny. In a house where conversations were clipped and formal, this steadiness stood out. Eleanor found herself lingering during routine exchanges, asking questions that extended beyond instruction. She told herself it was harmless, merely human curiosity born of boredom. Loneliness distorts perception. Eleanor's isolation had sharpened her need for connection, any form of acknowledgement that went beyond duty. Samuel became, in her mind, a listener, a witness to her existence. She spoke to him of trivial matters at first, the heat, the stillness of the days, the weight of expectation. Samuel listened because refusal was not an option. His silence was interpreted as attentiveness, though it was born of caution. Each conversation carried risk, yet Eleanor mistook his restraint for understanding. The imbalance of power between them defined every interaction, though Eleanor rarely acknowledged it consciously. As mistress of the house, her words were commands whether she intended them to be or not. Samuel's compliance was mandatory, not voluntary. Still, Eleanor began to construct a narrative in which their exchanges felt mutual, even intimate. This narrative allowed her to escape, briefly, from the rigid role imposed upon her. For Samuel, there was no such escape. He calculated danger constantly, measuring tone, timing, and proximity with survival in mind. The plantation itself seemed to absorb their unspoken tension. Enslaved people noticed changes quickly. They saw Eleanor call for Samuel more often, saw the way he returned from the house with his shoulders tight and his eyes fixed on the ground. They understood the warning signs. Experience had taught them that when boundaries blurred within the big house, consequences followed swiftly and rarely spared the innocent. Some tried to distance themselves from Samuel, not out of cruelty but fear. Association alone could be deadly. Thomas remained largely absent, both physically and emotionally. When he was home, he appeared distracted, his mind occupied with finances and reputation. Eleanor's attempts at conversation were met with polite indifference. The emotional void within the marriage widened, leaving Eleanor increasingly detached from reality. In the moral framework of her society, she was expected to endure silently. Instead, she drifted inward, rationalizing small transgressions as necessary relief from suffocation. In 1855, Mississippi, the social order depended on strict boundaries, racial, gendered, and moral. These boundaries were enforced not just through law, but through custom and violence. Any challenge to them threatened the entire structure. Eleanor sensed this on an intellectual level, yet emotional desperation dulled her caution. She began to believe she could control the situation, that discretion would protect them both. This belief ignored the fundamental truth of slavery. Control never belonged to the enslaved, and consequences were never evenly distributed. Samuel felt the shift acutely. The atmosphere in the house grew heavier, charged with something unnamed. He avoided Eleanor when possible, adjusted his routines, attempted to make himself less visible. Yet avoidance was difficult when commands summoned him. Each time he entered her presence, he braced for outcomes he could not predict or influence. His internal world became a place of constant vigilance, shaped by the knowledge that his life could be undone by a single misunderstanding or accusation. The plantation, like many others, presented itself as stable and orderly. In reality, it rested on fragile assumptions and suppressed truths. Beneath its surface lay countless unrecorded stories of exploitation and fear. Eleanor and Samuel were caught within this larger machinery, their individual choices constrained and distorted by a system designed to strip humanity from some while burdening others with hollow authority. As summer deepened, so did the tension. The days grew longer, the nights heavier with unspoken thoughts. The Whitaker house stood as it always had, columns white against the darkening sky, a symbol of permanence masking instability. Within its walls, lines were being approached that, once crossed, could never be redrawn. The stage was set not by passion alone, but by years of enforced silence, unequal power, and a society that made tragedy not only possible, but inevitable. The night that altered everything arrived quietly, without warning, as so many irreversible moments do. A late summer storm rolled across the Mississippi Delta, pressing humid air against the plantation house and rattling its tall windows with sudden bursts of rain. Thunder echoed across the fields, scattering the sounds of labor that usually lingered even after dusk. Thomas Whitaker was away, delayed in Natchez by business matters that seemed endless and all-consuming. His absence was not unusual, yet that night it felt heavier, as though the house itself recognized the vulnerability created by an empty master's room. Eleanor lay awake long after the lamps were extinguished. Sleep refused her, chased away by a familiar restlessness that had become her constant companion. The storm magnified every thought, every regret she had learned to bury during the daylight hours. In the darkness, she felt the full weight of her isolation, the years spent performing a role she never truly chose. Her marriage, her home, her identity, all felt borrowed, shaped by expectation rather than desire. In that moment, loneliness ceased to be a feeling and became a force, pushing her toward a decision she would later struggle to understand. She rang the bell for assistance, telling herself it was for something trivial, a simple request she could justify in the morning. When Samuel answered the summons, he did so with the practiced caution of a man who understood the danger of being called upstairs at night. His heartbeat quickened as he approached the bedroom, aware that nothing good came from such moments. Still, refusal was unthinkable. Obedience was survival. What followed cannot be simplified into romance or villainy without distorting the truth. The encounter unfolded within a framework where power was absolute and consent impossible to define. Eleanor's vulnerability did not erase her authority. Samuel's silence did not signal willingness. The system that governed their lives shaped every second, every unspoken command. Fear and confusion filled the space between them, entwined with emotions that neither fully understood nor could safely express. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the plantation soaked and silent. Samuel returned to his quarters, carrying a weight that felt unbearable. He understood immediately that his life had entered a new and far more dangerous phase. There was no scenario in which this ended safely for him. He avoided the house as much as possible in the following days, performing his duties with even greater restraint, hoping invisibility might protect him. Eleanor, meanwhile, moved through her routine in a haze, torn between guilt and self-deception. She told herself conflicting stories. At times, she framed the night as a mutual human failing, a moment of shared weakness brought on by isolation. At other times, she recognized the imbalance of power and felt sickened by it. These thoughts circled endlessly, offering no relief. The plantation's rigid moral code left no space for complexity, no language for accountability that did not involve total ruin. Silence became her refuge, even as it deepened her internal collapse. The enslaved community sensed the shift almost immediately. Such changes were rarely invisible to those forced to observe from the margins. Samuel's demeanor had changed, his movements sharper, his voice quieter than before. Eleanor's behavior too drew attention. She was distracted, anxious, and prone to calling for Samuel only to dismiss him quickly, as if unsure what she wanted. These contradictions raised alarms among those who understood how quickly suspicion could turn lethal. When Thomas returned, the atmosphere in the house tightened. He noticed Eleanor's unease and Samuel's avoidance, reading them through the lens of his own insecurities. Southern ideology had conditioned him to see himself as protector and authority, and any disruption to that image demanded correction. He did not ask gentle questions. His inquiries were sharp, accusatory, designed to reassert dominance rather than uncover truth. Rumors reached him before clarity did, carried by nervous glances and half-spoken warnings. In a society already primed to believe the worst about enslaved men, suspicion required little fuel. Samuel's guilt was assumed long before he was confronted. Eleanor's role was left unexamined, protected by the very myths that confined her. To acknowledge her agency would have meant acknowledging the fragility of the system Thomas depended on. The response was swift. Samuel was removed from his duties inside the house and taken away under the cover of night. No explanation was offered, no record carefully kept. Such matters were handled privately, shielded from scrutiny. Whether he was sold, beaten, or killed remains unknown, a deliberate erasure common to plantation records. The absence of detail was not an oversight, but a strategy, allowing the plantation to maintain its appearance of order. Eleanor learned of Samuel's removal indirectly. No one spoke to her about it openly, yet his absence echoed through the house. Each task he once performed now fell to someone else, his presence replaced, but never forgotten. She felt a sharp, consuming guilt paired with fear that she herself might be exposed. Her silence became absolute. In protecting her position, she had participated in his erasure, a truth she would carry for the rest of her life. Thomas never confronted her directly. His silence was calculated, serving both pride and preservation. Public acknowledgement of scandal would damage his reputation and threaten his standing among other planters. Instead, he retreated into authority, enforcing stricter discipline across the plantation. Punishment became more frequent, rules more rigid. Control was his answer to uncertainty. Within the enslaved quarters, Samuel's disappearance became a warning spoken only through looks and pauses. Everyone understood what it meant. White vulnerability, real or imagined, always resulted in black suffering. The lesson was reinforced not through explanation but through fear. Survival required submission, invisibility, and the suppression of any behavior that could be misinterpreted. Eleanor's health began to decline soon after. She lost weight, struggled with sleeplessness, and withdrew from social engagements. Doctors attributed her condition to nerves, offering remedies that addressed symptoms but not cause. In truth, her illness was the physical manifestation of moral and emotional collapse. She was trapped between guilt and denial, responsibility and powerlessness. The bedroom where the night occurred became unbearable to her. She avoided it when possible, wandering the house until exhaustion forced rest. The plantation, once merely isolating, now felt hostile, every familiar space charged with memory. Yet leaving was unthinkable. Society offered no escape for women in her position, only endurance. As weeks passed, the incident faded from open discussion, though it never truly disappeared. It lingered in altered routines, in Thomas's hardened demeanor, in Eleanor's withdrawn presence. The plantation resumed its outward rhythm, cotton harvested, meals served, lives consumed by labor. The illusion of stability was restored, but its foundation was weaker than before. This was how such stories ended in the antebellum South, not with resolution but with suppression. Truth was buried to protect power, responsibility was shifted downward, never upward. The system endured by consuming those within it, leaving behind fragments of lives that history would later struggle to reconstruct. The night itself became unspoken, yet its consequences spread quietly, shaping the remainder of every life it touched. Here is Section 3, written in English, approximately 2,000 words, no headings inside, and in the same dark historical documentary tone. This completes the story. The disappearance of Samuel did not bring closure. It brought a quieter, more corrosive form of decay that settled over the Whitaker plantation and refused to lift. Outwardly, life resumed its routines. Cotton was picked, meals were served, prayers were spoken. Inwardly, every relationship had shifted, recalibrated by fear and unspoken knowledge. The plantation did not heal, it adapted. That adaptation was the true strength of the system that governed it, a system capable of absorbing moral fractures without ever acknowledging them. Eleanor Whitaker became a shadow of her former self. Though she continued to occupy her role as mistress of the house, her authority felt hollow even to her. She issued fewer instructions, avoided unnecessary interactions, and withdrew from social obligations whenever possible. Guests noticed her absence at gatherings and explained it away as delicate health or feminine nerves. These excuses were readily accepted. In the antebellum South, a woman's suffering was tolerable so long as it remained quiet and did not disrupt the social order. Her isolation deepened into something more permanent. The house no longer felt like a refuge from the world, but a reminder of her confinement within it. Each corridor carried echoes of choices she could not undo. Each servant she passed reminded her of Samuel, not as a memory she could fully confront, but as an absence that pressed in from all sides. She never spoke his name again. Silence became both her punishment and her protection. Thomas Whitaker hardened into a man of sharper edges and fewer words. He interpreted Eleanor's withdrawal not as guilt or grief, but as weakness. Weakness, in his mind, demanded correction or containment. He tightened his control over the plantation, enforcing discipline with renewed severity. The enslaved workers felt this shift immediately. Infractions that once earned reprimand now resulted in harsher punishment. Fear became the primary tool of management, more efficient than negotiation or restraint. Thomas's masculinity, already strained by private disappointments, depended on the preservation of appearances. He could not afford scandal. To admit what had happened, even partially, would invite scrutiny from other planters and undermine his authority, so he chose denial, reshaping events into a version that absolved him of responsibility. In that version, Samuel was a threat removed, a problem solved. Eleanor was a fragile wife to be managed. The system remained intact. The enslaved community understood the truth far better than the Whitakers ever acknowledged. Samuel's disappearance was not mysterious. To them, they recognized the pattern, one repeated across plantations throughout the South. When white households sensed disorder, the consequences fell upon black bodies. When boundaries were blurred, it was enslaved people who paid the price. Samuel's fate became another lesson, added to a lifetime of lessons about survival. No one mourned him openly. Mourning was dangerous. Instead, memory lived in small, private gestures, a pause where his presence had once been, a task performed the way he used to perform it, a name remembered but never spoken aloud. The erasure was deliberate, enforced not only by the Whitakers, but by the necessity of staying alive. Forgetting, or pretending to forget, was sometimes the only form of resistance available. Eleanor's health continued to deteriorate over the years that followed. Doctors offered explanations that aligned with contemporary beliefs: hysteria, nerves, melancholy. Treatments addressed symptoms without touching the cause. No one suggested that her condition might be rooted in moral conflict or psychological trauma. Such ideas lay beyond the understanding of the time. Suffering was individualized, not contextualized. The system that produced harm was never questioned. As Eleanor aged, she became increasingly invisible within her own household. Younger servants replaced older ones, new routines formed, the memory of the scandal faded into rumor, then into silence. Yet its impact remained etched into her life. She never bore children, whether this was by choice, circumstance, or consequences unknown. In a society that measured a woman's legacy through heirs, this absence became another quiet judgment against her. The Whitaker plantation outlived Samuel, outlived Eleanor's youth, and likely outlived Thomas himself. Plantations were designed to endure, their continuity more important than the individuals who passed through them. Land changed hands, names changed, structures decayed and were rebuilt. What remained constant was the pattern: wealth built on exploitation, order maintained through violence, and stories buried to preserve power. When slavery eventually collapsed under the weight of war and emancipation, it did not bring answers for lives already erased. Samuel did not reappear in freedom records. His fate remained undocumented, his voice unrecovered. Eleanor did not leave behind confessions or letters that clarified her understanding of what had happened. Thomas's papers, if they survived, likely framed events in language that concealed more than it revealed. History inherited fragments, not conclusions. This absence of resolution is itself a historical truth. Stories like this rarely end with justice or acknowledgement. They end with silence. That silence was not accidental, it was cultivated. The antebellum South depended on silence to function. It depended on the suppression of inconvenient truths, on the careful management of narrative, and on the systematic denial of humanity to those it enslaved. What remains is not a tale of forbidden love, nor a simple moral parable. It is a study in imbalance. Eleanor's loneliness existed within privilege, shaped by constraints that were real but not equal. Samuel's vulnerability existed within bondage, absolute and inescapable. Their interaction cannot be understood outside that imbalance. To romanticize it is to erase the violence embedded within it. To reduce it to scandal is to miss its deeper significance. The true ending of this story is not found in a single moment, but in its aftermath. It lives in the way the system protected itself. It lives in the way responsibility flowed upward only until it threatened power, then was redirected downward. It lives in the way one life could be erased to preserve the comfort of another. And it lives in the way history itself struggles to hold such contradictions without smoothing them into something easier to accept. Against the myths that once portrayed the plantation as a place of order and refinement, this story stands as quiet resistance. It reveals how slavery corrupted intimacy, distorted morality, and ensured that harm was not an exception but a feature. The bed where the boundary was crossed is long gone. The house may no longer stand, but the consequences remain, echoing through records, silences, and inherited narratives. This is where the story ends, not because the suffering ended, but because history refused to record what came next. The silence that followed was the final act of control, one that outlived everyone involved. In confronting that silence, we are forced to recognize that the past is not distant or resolved. It lingers unfinished, asking to be seen for what it truly was.